5 days after moving my family halfway across the country, a video call erased my new job. 6 weeks later, their distribution system worth tens of millions of dollars began collapsing. The CEO who dropped me called back, begging, "We need you to save us." But I was not returning to ask for my job back. I was coming back to decide who would still be standing when their dirty secrets were finally exposed. My name is Amelia Simmons, and I am 41 years old. For nearly 2 decades, I built my entire life on a very specific kind of professional certainty. I was the person massive corporations called when their complex logistics networks needed to evolve without collapsing under their own weight. I managed large-scale warehouse transitions. I knew how to move millions of tons of freight, coordinate thousands of workers, and integrate new technologies without dropping a single pallet. But I never once anticipated that the most catastrophic operational failure of my entire career would be the relocation of my own family. The trap was set beautifully, built with precision and disguised as the ultimate reward for years of grueling work. A senior recruiter named Gavin Reese spent 6 months hunting me down. He called me during my brief lunch breaks, sent highly polished emails late at night, and painted a vibrant picture of a company desperate for my exact analytical mind. Carrington Freight Logic was launching a massive, high-stakes transition phase, and Gavin was utterly relentless in his pursuit. "This role was designed exactly for your experience," Gavin told me over our third phone call. His voice smooth and urgent. "We do not just want a manager, Amelia. We need a vice president of transition operations who can see the blind spots before we hit them. You are the missing piece to this puzzle." I believed him. I let the relentless flattery, the competitive executive salary, and the promise of a brilliant next step blind me to the fundamental, brutal rule of corporate America: loyalty is nothing more than a spreadsheet, and you are just a disposable cell in a column. Because of Gavin's airtight promises, I asked my family to completely dismantle their lives. We put our beautiful, deeply rooted house in the street, Lewis suburbs on the market, watching strangers walk through the rooms where our children had grown up. My husband, Daniel Simmons, walked into his superintendent's office and officially resigned from a stable, highly respected position as a middle school vice principal. He did it with a reassuring smile, holding my hand and telling me my career was finally ready for the main stage, and he was proud to support me. The kids paid a much steeper, quieter price. Tessa, at 16 years old, had to abandon the regional debate team that was acting as her golden ticket to out-of-state college scholarships. She spent her final weekend packing her hard-earned trophies into brown cardboard boxes, her face set in a tight, unreadable expression that broke my heart. Owen, who was 12 years old, had to say a tearful goodbye to his youth baseball team right before the start of the summer playoffs. We traded our history, our community, and our security for the humid, unfamiliar air of Tampa, Florida. We had been living in the new rental house for exactly 5 days. The air inside the stifling rooms still smelled heavily of industrial packing tape, fresh paint, and corrugated cardboard. I was sitting at the small dining table, a half-empty mug of cold coffee resting next to my open laptop, trying to figure out which unmarked box held our everyday silverware. My screen chimed with a sharp, jarring notification. It was an unscheduled video call from Marla Kent, the head of human resources at Carrington Freight Logic. I clicked the green accept button, quickly smoothing my hair and adjusting my collar, fully expecting a quick, friendly check-in regarding my onboarding schedule for the upcoming Monday. Marla was sitting in a perfectly sterile gray corporate office. Her face was entirely devoid of any readable emotion. She did not ask how the grueling cross-country move went. She did not ask how my husband and children were settling into their new environment. "Amelia, I am calling to inform you that your role no longer exists because plans have changed," Marla said. Her voice was flat, highly practiced, and utterly robotic. I just stared at the high-definition screen. The words simply did not process in my brain. The cognitive dissonance was too massive. In the background, through the thin walls of the rental house, I could clearly hear the sound of packing tape ripping as Daniel worked on unpacking the heavy boxes of books in the living room. "I am sorry," I said. my voice sounding eerily calm, disconnected from my own body. I just moved my entire family across the country. My start date is in exactly 3 days. The executive team has restructured the operational budget for the upcoming quarter, Marla continued, her eyes flickering slightly as she read from a prepared script somewhere off camera. We will be providing 2 weeks of severance pay to assist your family with the transition. 2 weeks. My husband had surrendered his entire career. My children had given up their schools and their friends. We had legally bound ourselves to a 12-month lease on a house in a state where we did not know a single soul, all for 2 weeks of basic pay. Marla, I said, gripping the edge of the dining table so hard my knuckles turned white. Gavin Reese aggressively recruited me for 6 entire months. Gavin is no longer handling this specific account, Marla replied instantly, not missing a beat. Your access to the company portal will be automatically terminated by the end of this hour. We will send all of the necessary exit paperwork via email. I did not scream at her. I did not beg for my job. I simply nodded once, feeling the sheer, unadulterated humiliation sinking into my bones like molten lead, and reached out to end the call. The sudden silence in the kitchen was instantly deafening, pressing aggressively against my eardrums. My hands were shaking violently as I immediately opened a new browser tab and logged into the Carrington employee portal before my credentials officially expired. I bypassed the standard onboarding documents and navigated straight to the relocation reimbursement file. The status icon was completely grayed out. Right next to it, in small, cruel red letters, was the word frozen. They were not just taking away my job and my livelihood, they were actively washing their hands of the tens of thousands of dollars it had cost to physically move my family down here. The corporate trap had snapped shut with terrifying speed, and we were left bleeding out on the floor. I spent the rest of the long, suffocating afternoon in a state of absolute numb paralysis. I aimlessly arranged and rearranged canned goods in the pantry so I would not have to look Daniel in the eye. The physical ground beneath my feet felt entirely illusory, like I was falling down a dark shaft with no bottom in sight. I waited until the sweltering Florida sun went down and the kids were finally asleep in their new, unfamiliar bedrooms. Before I told him, he did not yell, he did not throw anything. He just stood by the kitchen sink, letting the tap water run over a single ceramic plate for a very long time. The muscle in his jaw feathered, but he kept his voice steady, telling me we would figure it out, that we always figured it out. But the dead, hollow look in his eyes betrayed the crushing weight of the betrayal. Later that night, the suffocating heat and the anxiety made sleep impossible. I woke up around 2 a.m. The space in the bed beside me was cold and empty. I walked softly down the dark, narrow hallway, mindful of the creaking floorboards. The faint blue glow of a laptop screen spilled out from the kitchen doorway. Daniel was sitting alone at the kitchen island. He was wearing his faded St. Louis Cardinals shirt, his shoulders slumped as he stared blankly at the bright screen. I stood frozen in the shadows of the hallway and watched as he slowly, painstakingly typed out his work history. He was updating his professional resume for the very first time in over 10 years. Seeing my fiercely loyal husband, a man who had willingly sacrificed his own hard-earned professional stability for the sake of my ambition, forced to sit in the dark and prepare to beg for entry-level administrative jobs in the middle of the night, was the physical blow that finally shattered my chest. It was a suffocating, violent wave of guilt and anger. I backed away slowly, pressing both of my hands hard over my mouth to keep the desperate sob from escaping my throat and waking the children. I retreated to the dark master bedroom and lay rigid on top of the unmade covers, staring up at the slow, rhythmic spinning of the ceiling fan. The panic was a tangible, physical weight, sitting heavily on my chest and pressing down on my lungs until drawing a breath felt like a monumental effort. But as the silent hours ticked closer to dawn, the overwhelming, paralyzing panic began to slowly crystallize into something entirely different. It hardened into something incredibly cold, meticulously sharp, and utterly unforgiving. My racing mind began to replay the grueling, multi-round interview process I had gone through with Carrington's executive team. I thought deeply about the core technical project they had explicitly hired me to oversee. It was a massive, highly sensitive automation rollout for their most strategic, lucrative retail client. During the final technical evaluation interview, their senior leadership had proudly showed me their complex architectural plan for the new warehouse robots. I remembered leaning forward, pointing directly at the projection screen, and sternly warning their lead engineers about a specific, highly dangerous foundational flaw in their logic. I had told them, in no uncertain terms, that their shiny new automated system would completely fail to communicate cleanly with the legacy warehouse management software currently operating in their mixed facility hubs. I explained exactly how the data packets would collide, how the inventory tracking would fracture, and how the entire system would eventually bottleneck and collapse. They had all nodded thoughtfully. They had smiled wide, reassuring smiles, and told me that my sharp eye was exactly why they needed me to steer the ship and manage the risk. They had aggressively bought my silence and my specialized expertise, used my name and my industry reputation to validate their reckless, overly ambitious project timeline, and then ruthlessly discarded me the moment they needed to save a few arbitrary lines on a quarterly budget sheet. They thought they had successfully buried me in the sprawling Florida suburbs. They assumed I was just a desperate, overwhelmed mother who would quietly accept a pathetic 2 weeks of severance pay, sign a standard non-disclosure agreement, and fade away into financial ruin without making a single sound. They thought they held all the cards and all the power. They had absolutely no idea what they had just set in motion. I spent the entire following morning staring at a master spreadsheet on my laptop screen. Cell by cell, row by row, I calculated the exact timeline of our impending ruin. The 2 weeks of severance pay they had offered was nothing but a cruel joke. Once I factored in the 12-month lease on the Tampa house, the massive security deposit we would never get back if we broke our contract, the utility setup fees, and the soaring cost of basic groceries, the math was brutal and completely undeniable. We had exactly 2 months, 60 days before our entire life savings hit zero, and high-interest credit cards became our only remaining lifeline. Retreating was mathematically impossible. The housing market in our old street, Lewis neighborhood had surged the exact week we closed on our sale. We could not afford to buy our old life back even if we begged. Tessa's old high school had immediately given her hard-earned spot in the advanced placement track to a waitlisted student. Daniel's school district had already promoted a younger, eager teacher to his vice principal desk. The bridge behind us was not just burned. Carrington Freight Logic had systematically completely demolished it. I immediately began sending out my resume across the greater Tampa area. Every morning, I sat at the kitchen island with my cold coffee and cast a desperate net into a job market that did not know me. The responses were swift and devastating. I was either vastly overqualified for the regional logistics manager roles, or the offers were so insultingly low they felt like a physical slap to the face. One regional director of a local supply chain company offered me a starting salary that was 40% less than what Carrington had legally promised me in writing, casually suggesting I should just be grateful to get my foot in the door in a brand new state. Meanwhile, Gavin Reese, the slick recruiter who had hounded me for half a year, vanished into thin air. I tried calling his direct office line. It rang twice and then dropped into a generic corporate voicemail. I sent 2 polite, probing emails that miraculously bounced back as undeliverable. When I checked my professional networking profile to send him a direct message, I saw the ultimate cowardly move. He had quietly removed me from his connections. I was a massive liability that he had efficiently and cleanly scrubbed from his digital footprint. No phone calls, no apologies, just complete, silent erasure. Daniel refused to let the ship sink while I was frantically bailing water. Less than a week after the Carrington termination call, he walked into a small, severely underfunded private academy a few miles down the highway and accepted a temporary substitute teaching position. He was a deeply respected man with a master's degree in educational administration. Suddenly reduced to monitoring noisy study halls and grading middle school history quizzes just to secure temporary health insurance and keep the electricity running. He never complained, not once. Every morning at 6:30, he kissed my forehead, grabbed his insulated travel mug, and walked out the door. The quiet dignity with which he swallowed his pride made my stomach twist with a sickening blend of profound love and absolute, blinding fury. The emotional toll on the children was a quiet, suffocating presence that filled every room of the rental house. Tessa retreated into a terrifyingly polite, impenetrable silence. If she had screamed at me, if she had thrown her unpacked boxes against the bedroom wall and called me a fool, I could have handled it. I could have absorbed her anger and apologized. But she just floated through the house like a ghost, eating her dinners quickly and retreating to her room to read in the dark. She never brought up the debate team. She never mentioned the college scholarship she was rapidly losing out on. Her silence was a heavy, suffocating weight, a massive emotional debt I owed her that I had absolutely no currency to repay. Owen, on the other hand, was desperately trying to be brave. He unpacked his baseball gloves and arranged them neatly on his new closet shelf. But every few days, usually when I was washing dishes or folding laundry, he would wander into the room and ask the innocent questions that cut me down to the bone. "Mom, are we really going to stay here?" he would ask, his voice small and uncertain as he leaned against the doorframe. "Should I put up my posters? Or are we going back home soon?" I had to look directly into my 12-year-old son's eyes and lie, promising him that everything was perfectly fine, that we were planting new roots, all while silently counting down the 60 days we had left before total financial collapse. Desperation breeds paranoia, and my paranoia quickly turned into a methodical, cold-blooded compulsion. I stopped crying in the shower. I stopped panicking in the middle of the night. Instead, I started saving absolutely everything. Late at night, while the house slept, I opened my personal laptop and combed through months of digital correspondence. I downloaded every single recruitment email Gavin had ever sent me, ensuring the timestamps were clearly visible. I saved the official offer letter with the Carrington corporate letterhead. I captured high-resolution screenshots of the detailed onboarding schedule, the executive welcome messages, and the precise, legally binding relocation promises they had made. I built a secure, encrypted folder on an external hard drive, treating my own employment history like an active crime scene. I needed an undeniable paper trail. I needed concrete proof that I had not misunderstood the terms, that I had not been fired for cause, and that I had been intentionally lured into a carefully constructed snare. It was during this obsessive late-night digital hoarding that I stumbled upon the fatal crack in their corporate armor. I was reviewing a welcome email from my would-be department head, sent exactly 2 weeks before our cross-country move. It contained a generic hyperlink to the company's internal server, directing me to review the organizational structure for the new warehouse automation project. I clicked the link out of pure, masochistic curiosity, fully expecting a bright red access denied screen to pop up. Instead, the page loaded perfectly. The Carrington IT department, in their hasty, sloppy rush to lock me out of my official email accounts, had completely forgotten to revoke my viewing privileges for this specific, compartmentalized project dashboard. I held my breath as my eyes scanned the screen. I scrolled down the internal presentation deck, my heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. There, on slide 14, was the newly updated organizational chart for the Hearthline Markets Integration Project. My name was sitting right there, firmly at the top of the transition hierarchy, listed as the Vice President of Transition Operations. I checked the metadata on the file. The date on the document was only 2 days old. The project was not canceled. The role was not eliminated. The HR representative had looked me dead in the eye through a webcam and boldly lied to my face. The company was still actively using my name, my credentials, and my flawless industry reputation on their internal documents to prop up their failing project and appease their stakeholders, even as they threw my family out onto the street. The plan had never changed. Only my physical participation in it had. They had stolen my credibility to secure their timeline and then cut me loose to save a fraction of their budget. I closed the laptop slowly. The paralyzing fear that had gripped me for weeks evaporated instantly, replaced by a terrifying, crystalline clarity. They had taken my stability, my husband's career, and my children's peace of mind. But sitting alone in that dark kitchen, staring at the glowing power light of my computer, I realized they had made one catastrophic miscalculation. They had left me with absolutely nothing left to lose, and all the time in the world to figure out exactly how to break them. Exactly 6 weeks passed. That was 42 days of waking up with a heavy, physical ache in my chest, carefully rationing the rapidly dwindling funds in our checking account, and watching my deeply overqualified husband drive off in the humid morning air to monitor unruly middle schoolers just to keep our health insurance active. The stifling Florida heat had become the inescapable backdrop to our silent, grinding endurance. We were surviving, but the structural integrity of our family was cracking under the immense pressure. Then, on a Tuesday afternoon, my cell phone vibrated aggressively on the kitchen counter. It was an out-of-state area code I did not immediately recognize. My first instinct was to let the call drop into voicemail, assuming it was just another dead-end automated recruiter or a local bill collector getting an early start on our grace period. But a strange, quiet instinct made me reach out and swipe the green accept icon. "Hello?" I said, my voice neutral. "Amelia, it is Nolan Pierce." The name hung in the dense air of my kitchen like a physical object. Nolan Pierce, the chief executive officer of Carrington Freight Logic, the man sitting at the very apex of the corporate food chain, the executive who had ultimately signed the approval to rip my family out of the Midwest and then casually erase my job 5 days after we arrived. "Hello, Nolan," I replied. My voice was completely flat, devoid of any warmth or surprise. I did not ask how he was doing. I did not ask how he had bypassed my blocked emails to get my direct personal number. I simply waited. The silence stretched across the digital connection, and for the very first time in a month and a half, I felt the unmistakable, heavy weight of leverage shifting back to my side of the board. Nolan cleared his throat nervously. He did not bother with pleasantries, corporate small talk, or any cowardly attempts at an apology. He went straight to the bleeding wound. "We have a critical Tier 1 situation on our hands, Amelia," Nolan said, his voice strained and tight. "The Hearthline Markets integration is collapsing." I pulled out one of the wooden dining chairs and sat down smoothly, opening my laptop. Define collapsing. Nolan exhaled heavily, a ragged, exhausted sound that betrayed weeks of high-stakes panic and sleepless nights. "Our primary distribution hubs are failing across the board. Outbound logistics are a complete disaster. We have heavy delivery trucks sitting at the loading docks for 6 hours, only to leave half empty because the automated picking algorithms are completely freezing mid-cycle. Last night alone, we had 40 pallets of premium refrigerated dairy and meat misrouted to an ambient temperature holding zone. Every single item spoiled, but the worst part is our data. Our real-time inventory tracking is lagging by up to 5 hours. We literally do not know what is on the warehouse shelves and what is out on the highway." He paused, likely wiping cold sweat from his forehead. "Hearthline is threatening to activate the severe penalty clauses in our master service agreement. We are looking at a catastrophic breach of contract worth tens of millions of dollars if we do not stabilize the operational flow by the end of this month." I stared at the blank wall in front of me, listening intently to the exact disaster I had explicitly predicted in their glass boardroom 6 months ago. It was almost poetic in its predictability. The Hearthline project was a massive, highly complex, mixed-facility integration. Carrington was blindly trying to drop a state-of-the-art, high-velocity automated robotics system into regional distribution centers that were still stubbornly running on 15-year-old legacy warehouse management software. I did not need to see the server logs to know exactly what was happening on their floors. The new robotics system was firing thousands of microdata packets per second, while the old software was strictly designed to process information in slow, rigid batches. It was a massive digital bottleneck. The robots were sitting idle on the floor, waiting for confirmation protocols that the old software thought it had already successfully transmitted. The two systems were fundamentally out of sync, creating massive data collisions that ultimately shut down the physical machinery. The hardware was fine. The communication architecture was rotting from the inside out. "What about your internal transition team?" I asked, keeping my tone perfectly analytical and detached. "You had a full, highly compensated roster handling this specific architecture." "The project lead tendered his immediate resignation yesterday morning," Nolan admitted, the deep humiliation evident in his fractured voice. "He just walked out of the building. Our internal engineering teams are running in circles, patching individual routing errors while the whole network slows down to a crawl. The clients are furious." He took a sharp, desperate breath. "Amelia, we desperately need you to come in and fix this. You saw the original blueprints. I distinctly remember your final interview. You were the only person who accurately flagged this specific integration risk. I am prepared to offer you an emergency consultant contract at a premium hourly rate. It is a very high fee. And assuming things go well and we get the Hearthline account back on track, we can sit down and discuss bringing you back into the corporate fold permanently." There it was, the ultimate bait. The arrogant, deeply ingrained corporate assumption that I was sitting by the phone, desperate and hungry, just waiting for a chance to crawl back to the master's table for the comforting illusion of a permanent salary. He actually believed he was doing me a generous favor. I did not laugh. I did not unleash the 6 weeks of repressed, bitter rage that had been eating away at my stomach. Anger is a remarkably useless emotion in business negotiations. Pure leverage is the only currency that truly matters. "I understand the severe scope of the problem, Nolan," I said smoothly, my voice cold and precise. "However, I need to thoroughly evaluate my current commitments before taking on a crisis intervention of this massive magnitude. I will review my schedule tonight and give you my official response tomorrow morning. Amelia, please, every single hour we lose. I will speak with you tomorrow. Nolan." "Have a good afternoon." I pressed the red end call button and set the phone face down on the table. My hands were not shaking. My heart was not racing. For the first time in 42 days, the suffocating fog in my brain vanished, leaving behind a terrifying, crystalline clarity. Less than 3 hours later, the phone rang again. This time, the caller ID displayed a name I knew very well from the upper echelons of the logistics industry circuit, Dana Kell. She was a senior executive vice president at Blue Veil Distribution, Carrington's largest and most aggressive competitor in the national supply chain sector. "Amelia, it is Dana," she said, her voice warm, sharp, and highly professional. "I will get right to the point. This industry is incredibly small, and blood in the water travels fast. We know Carrington is bleeding out horribly on the Hearthline account, and we also noticed you are suddenly on the open market down in Tampa. I do not know what kind of mess they dragged you into, but their catastrophic loss is an absolute gift for our team." Dana seamlessly proceeded to lay out a very attractive, highly secure lifeline. Blue Veil was aggressively expanding their southeastern operations. She formally offered me an executive director position. It came with a generous, highly stable salary, full corporate health benefits, and the exact kind of professional safety net my husband and children desperately needed to finally breathe easily again. "We deeply respect your expertise, Amelia," Dana added smoothly. "Come over to Blue Veil. Let us show you how a real logistics firm treats its top-tier talent." I thanked her with absolute sincerity, told her I was deeply flattered by the generous offer, and asked for 24 hours to process the details before giving my final answer. When Daniel finally came home from his exhausting substitute teaching shift, his shoulders slumped and his briefcase heavy, I did not tell him about either of the phone calls. I cooked dinner, helped Owen study for his science test, and patiently waited until the entire house was completely dark and silent. At 2 o'clock in the morning, I sat back down at the kitchen island, staring at the glowing screen of my laptop. I had 2 highly distinct paths laid out before me, both carefully designed by other people to serve their own corporate interests. The first path was to accept Nolan's consulting gig, dive into the trenches to fix his massive architectural mess, and quietly hope they graciously handed me my old executive title back as a reward. The second path was to accept Dana's offer, step cleanly into a new, well-oiled corporate machine, and spend the next 10 years making millions of dollars for someone else's board of directors, all while praying I never ended up on another arbitrary spreadsheet's chopping block. Neither option was acceptable. Going back to Carrington as an obedient employee would be an act of utter, humiliating submission. Going to Blue Veil would simply be a retreat into the exact same volatile system that had just tried to completely destroy my family. I opened my web browser. I did not navigate to a corporate job board. I went directly to the Florida Department of State Business Registration portal. If Carrington Freight Logic desperately needed my brain to save their tens of millions of dollars, they were not going to rent it by the hour, and they were certainly not going to dangle a superficial job title over my head like a carrot on a stick. I was entirely done being a hired hand. I was permanently done letting faceless corporate boards dictate my family's geographic location and financial survival. I pulled out my credit card and slowly, deliberately typed in the registration details for a brand new limited liability company. I filled out the official articles of organization, firmly assigning myself as the sole managing member and registered agent. I paid the state filing fees and hit the final submit button. By the time the sun began to rise over the humid Tampa suburbs, casting a pale, creeping gray light through the kitchen blinds, I was no longer an unemployed, desperate mother looking for a corporate paycheck. I closed the laptop and took a long sip of cold water. At 4 a.m, right there on the scratched surface of a rental house dining table, Simmons Cutover Group was officially born. I was finally ready to call Nolan Pierce back, but this time, the rules of engagement were going to be entirely mine. I drove straight into the downtown business district the next morning and retained the most aggressive corporate contract attorney I could find in the city. We sat in his heavily air-conditioned office for over 4 hours, systematically stripping Carrington Freight Logic's standard consultant agreement down to the bare, exposed studs. I was not going to simply sign whatever generic, protective document Nolan Pierce's legal team threw my way. I rewrote the terms of my engagement with the cold, surgical precision of someone who knew exactly where the company's major arteries were located. I demanded an emergency crisis intervention fee that was essentially triple the executive salary they had originally promised me. I mandated a strictly enforced 50% non-refundable retainer to be wired directly into the Simmons Cutover Group business account before I would even consent to open a single technical file. I explicitly dictated an absolute remote work arrangement. I refused to set foot inside their sterile corporate headquarters. I clearly defined my scope of authority, legally securing absolute veto power over any decisions made by their lead engineering team. Most importantly, under the careful guidance of my new attorney, I buried a very specific, highly lethal clause deep within the master service agreement. It explicitly stripped away their standard non-compete restrictions. The clause legally permitted my independent firm to consult for other active clients in the exact same logistics sector, provided I maintained strict confidentiality regarding Carrington's proprietary data. It was the ultimate insurance policy, hiding in plain sight. When I emailed the heavily revised contract back to Nolan, the corporate pushback was immediate and entirely predictable. He called my cell phone less than 20 minutes later. "Amelia, these terms are completely unworkable and wildly out of bounds," Nolan snapped, the underlying desperation clearly leaking through his thin facade of executive authority. "The daily fee is astronomical. Furthermore, our legal department is having a collective heart attack over the lack of exclusivity in this draft. We are trusting you with highly sensitive trade architecture, and you are casually asking for the legal right to walk across the street and consult for our direct rivals." I let him vent his frustration. I did not interrupt his tirade. I did not defensively justify my pricing, and I certainly did not apologize for the aggressive terms. "The fee directly reflects the exact market cost of saving a multi-million-dollar retail account." "Nolan," I replied, my voice steady, flat, and completely devoid of warmth. "The lack of exclusivity reflects the fundamental fact that I am a sovereign business entity, not your disposable employee. You have until exactly 5 o'clock this afternoon to sign the document in its entirety and initiate the wire transfer. After that strict deadline passes, my availability permanently closes. I ended the call without waiting for his customary corporate goodbye. At exactly 4:15 that afternoon, my cell phone pinged with a secure banking notification. I opened the application and stared quietly at the screen. The initial deposit had successfully cleared. It was a sum of money so large it momentarily stole the breath from my lungs. It was enough capital to instantly wipe out our crippling lease penalty, cover a full year of living expenses, and build a massive, impenetrable financial fortress around my family. I walked into the quiet living room and handed the phone to Daniel. He looked down at the bright screen. He read the massive number once, blinked heavily, and read it again. He did not smile. He did not cheer or pull me into a celebratory embrace. He just sat heavily on the edge of the fabric sofa, staring at the digital balance in absolute stunned silence. I knew exactly what was racing through his mind. He was deeply terrified that acknowledging this massive influx of cash, this sudden, miraculous lifeline, would somehow break a fragile spell and send us violently crashing back down into the financial abyss. I placed my hand firmly on his shoulder, letting the silent, heavy weight of the moment settle between us. We were no longer drowning in the dark. The following morning at 8 o'clock sharp, I logged into the Carrington Engineering Division's secure video conference. There were 12 individual squares on the screen, revealing a chaotic, disorganized mix of exhausted project managers, panicked lead developers, and nervous operational directors. They looked thoroughly battered, visibly running on empty cups of stale coffee and sheer, unadulterated terror. "Let us begin," I said, cutting sharply through the nervous background murmurs. I shared my screen, pulling up the raw data logs and system architecture maps Nolan had forwarded to me late the previous night. I deliberately did not waste a single second with polite introductions or empty corporate platitudes. I took exactly 15 minutes to systematically and brutally dissect their catastrophic operational failure. I pointed directly to the precise digital intersections where the new automated picking algorithms were aggressively suffocating the legacy warehouse management software. I highlighted the massive data packet collisions, the phantom inventory feedback loops, and the exact physical zones on the warehouse floor where the heavy machinery was freezing up while waiting for digital clearance that would never arrive. When I finished speaking and closed the presentation deck, the virtual meeting room was completely dead silent. The arrogant lead engineers who had politely dismissed my severe warnings during the interview process months ago were now staring blankly at their webcams, pale, defeated, and entirely mute. "Effective immediately, all reactionary blind patching stops," I ordered, my voice cutting through the heavy silence like a freshly sharpened blade. "You are running around the warehouse floor with buckets while the entire structure is on fire. We are establishing a permanent, highly disciplined war room. I want dedicated, encrypted communication channels opened for every single operational shift. I require granular, warehouse-by-warehouse performance metrics uploaded directly to my primary dashboard by 6 o'clock every single evening. Furthermore, absolutely no one touches the core routing logic without my explicit written approval." I watched the faces of 2 senior project managers on the video grid. Several months ago, they had looked at me with polite indifference, viewing me merely as another incoming executive to be managed. Now, their eyes held a distinct, undeniable blend of deep fear and profound relief. They were no longer looking at the discarded, humiliated woman who had been quietly escorted out to the digital door. They were looking at the absolute, undisputed authority in the room. I was the only person holding a functional map leading out of their burning building. After I abruptly ended the grueling technical sprint, I leaned back in my home office chair and looked out the window at the bright, sweltering Florida sun. The massive sum of money sitting securely in my corporate bank account was a profound, life-altering relief. But as I slowly closed my laptop, I realized something incredibly vital. The money was just a pleasant byproduct of the transaction. The actual victory, the deep, intoxicating thrill that finally settled the heavy, bitter score in my chest, was the sheer, undeniable mechanics of the power shift. The exact same executives who had casually and ruthlessly thrown my entire family into chaos just to protect their quarterly bottom line were now forced to operate every single day under a rigid, unforgiving system of my own personal design. They had tried to permanently bury me under the crushing weight of their corporate machine, assuming I would just quietly fade away. But I had clawed my way back to the surface, and I had rewritten the entire instruction manual from scratch. They were playing my specific game now, and they were going to follow every single rule I dictated, line by agonizing line. While I was aggressively untangling the massive digital knot on Carrington's warehouse floors, I deliberately arranged a quiet lunch meeting with Dana Kell from Blue Veil Distribution. We met at a discreet, high-end steakhouse located entirely outside the downtown corporate radius. Officially, we were just two industry veterans discussing modern operational architecture and macroeconomic supply chain trends. I was meticulously careful. I did not violate a single line of my non-disclosure agreement. I did not mention Carrington by name, nor did I expose any of their proprietary data. Instead, I simply leaned across the white linen tablecloth and provided a highly detailed, theoretical breakdown of the exact catastrophic failures that naturally occur when a logistics firm blindly forces high-speed robotics to interface with antiquated batch processing software in a mixed facility environment. Dana was an apex predator in the corporate world. She listened intently, her eyes narrowing as she instantly decoded the massive, unspoken implications of my theoretical model. She knew exactly whose burning building I was currently being paid to extinguish. By the time the waiter cleared our plates, Dana slid a pristine business folder across the table. Blue Veil was quietly preparing a massive, highly competitive bid for the Gulf Harvest Cooperative, a massive retail chain looking to overhaul their regional distribution. Dana wanted my firm, Simmons Cutover Group, to serve as the lead technical consultant on their proposal. I drove back to my home office and pulled up my master service agreement with Carrington. I read the specific clause my attorney had buried in the final draft. It was completely ironclad. Carrington was paying me an exorbitant premium to fix their disaster, and their own legal department had blindly signed away their right to stop me from simultaneously arming their biggest rival. That same evening, the narrative of my termination began to fracture in a completely unexpected direction. I received an encrypted message on my personal phone from a former logistics coordinator I had briefly interacted with during my original Carrington interview process. The message contained no text, only a single, high-resolution photograph of a glowing computer monitor. It was a leaked snapshot of Carrington's internal departmental budget for the upcoming third quarter. I zoomed in on the columns. There, clearly listed under the transition operations budget, was my exact executive salary. The financial line item had not been erased. The capital had been fully approved and allocated, completely contradicting the HR department's robotic claim that my role had been eliminated due to a sudden lack of funding. The change of plans was a total fabrication. The company had the money. The role was fully budgeted. Someone in the upper echelon had actively chosen to sever my employment while intentionally keeping the funding intact on the ledger. At exactly midnight, my phone vibrated again. It was a direct text message from one of the exhausted shift leaders currently working the floor at a Carrington hub. "If your new firm is ever looking to expand its roster, please let me know," the message read. "I do not want to drown with people who are constantly pretending the ship is not actively sinking." I sat in the dark kitchen, the blue light of my phone illuminating the quiet space. I was not just patching a broken system anymore. I was standing directly in front of an open door, quietly siphoning off their most competent talent and their market share. But the leaked budget photo planted a dark, freezing seed of realization in my stomach. My termination was not a careless administrative error or a sudden pivot in strategy. Someone had deliberately mapped out the destruction of my career, and I still did not know their real name. I turned my home office into a digital forensics lab. I began ruthlessly tracking the digital footprints of my own recruitment, cross-referencing old calendar invites, onboarding document versions, and the precise metadata timestamps hidden inside Gavin Reese's old email threads. I treated my own destroyed career as a hostile corporate audit. The disparate pieces of the puzzle finally snapped together when I pulled up public financial filings and connected them to the timeline of the Hearthline Markets project. Carrington was not just struggling with warehouse operations. They were quietly preparing to secure a massive refinancing package from a syndicate of Tier 1 banks. To secure that critical loan, they needed to present a flawless, highly inflated operating margin right before the end of the fiscal quarter. I looked at the leaked budget photo and the client-facing presentation decks I had saved. The strategy was brutally simple and profoundly unethical. Carrington had aggressively recruited me, heavily leveraging my flawless industry reputation, to convince Hearthline Markets that their new automated project was under elite, experienced leadership. They put my name and my face on the glossy slide decks to lock in the massive client contract, but the second my family actually crossed the state line, they terminated me. They kept the prestigious contract I helped legitimize, but immediately erased my high executive salary from their internal payroll ledger, instantly creating an artificial spike in their quarterly profit margins just in time to show the banking syndicate. The betrayal went even deeper. I uncovered an embedded email thread from Gavin Reese. The timestamp clearly proved that the corporate hiring freeze had been officially mandated a full 7 days before I sold my house in Missouri. Gavin knew I was walking into a slaughterhouse, yet he continued to aggressively push me to sign the final relocation paperwork. I quietly expanded my search, reaching out through highly discreet industry channels. Within 48 hours, I found exactly what I was looking for. I connected with a senior regional manager who had been relocated to Phoenix, and a supply chain director who had uprooted his life for a role in Pittsburgh. Both of them had been aggressively recruited by Carrington. Both of them had been terminated within 10 days of arriving in their new cities. They had received the exact same robotic phone call, the exact same pathetic 2 weeks of severance pay, and the exact same excuse about budget restructuring. This was not an isolated incident of corporate cruelty. Carrington was utilizing high-level executive recruitment as a cheap coat of prestige paint. They lured top talent to pacify nervous clients and secure massive loans, and then immediately slaughtered the new hires to artificially pad their financial ledgers. Daniel walked into the office later that evening, carrying 2 cups of tea. He looked at the massive web of printed emails, financial timelines, and organizational charts spread across my desk. He sighed softly, his face showing the deep, lingering exhaustion of the past 2 months. "We have the money now, Amelia," Daniel said quietly, setting the mug down. "Your new company is thriving. We are safe. Maybe it is time to just let this go and focus on our family." I looked up at him, feeling the absolute weight of the room shift and settle. The air in the office felt incredibly heavy. "If they do this to one person, it is a tragedy," I said, my voice dangerously calm and utterly devoid of hesitation. "But if they do this to multiple people across the country, it is not a mistake. Daniel, it is a revenue model." I did not log onto social media to draft an emotional, viral warning. I did not contact industry journalists to launch a messy public smear campaign. Shouting is for people who lack leverage. Instead, I meticulously began compiling sworn affidavits, verified relocation contracts, documented technical warnings, and undeniable proof of their internal accounting fraud. As the heavy binders of evidence slowly filled, the ultimate objective became terrifyingly clear. This was no longer just a desperate mother fighting to reclaim her stolen dignity or secure a paycheck. This was the meticulous construction of a corporate guillotine. I was going to systematically strip away their entire facade, destroying their multi-million-dollar empire using the exact same legally binding signatures they had used to destroy my family. The inevitable legal threat arrived on a Thursday morning, packaged in a high-priority, certified email from Carrington Freight Logic's general counsel. The subject line was written in aggressive, capitalized letters, demanding the immediate cessation of all external consulting activities. The attached letter was a masterpiece of corporate intimidation, stretching over 4 pages of dense legal jargon. They formally accused me of a direct conflict of interest, threatened immediate and severe litigation, and demanded a complete surrender of any communications I had shared with Blue Veil Distribution. I did not panic. I did not even bother to call my attorney. I simply poured myself a fresh cup of coffee, sat down at my home office desk, and hit the reply button. I kept my response exceptionally brief. I directed their bloated legal department to page 7, paragraph 4, subsection B of our master service agreement. I politely reminded them that this specific clause, explicitly permitting my firm to engage with competing entities provided no proprietary data was breached, had been thoroughly reviewed, approved, and signed by their very own chief legal officer. I attached a scanned, high-resolution copy of the signature page just to ensure there was no administrative confusion. Less than an hour later, my cell phone rang. It was Nolan Pierce. He bypassed his administrative assistant and called me directly, his breathing heavy and erratic through the speaker. "Amelia, what exactly are you trying to pull here?" Nolan demanded, attempting to inject a booming, authoritative gravel into his voice. "You are actively using our retainer to keep your lights on while you simultaneously hand our biggest competitor the architecture to win the Gulf Harvest bid. That is textbook corporate sabotage." I let him finish his bluster, listening to the sharp edge of panic hiding beneath his anger. "It is not sabotage, Nolan. It is free market capitalism," I replied, my voice as calm and steady as a metronome. "I am fulfilling every single metric of our contract. The Hearthline network is stabilizing exactly as promised, and your error rates are dropping daily. What I do with my remaining billable hours is entirely my prerogative. I will terminate your contract today," he threatened, though the underlying desperation in his tone made the words sound incredibly hollow. "I will cut off your server access and drag you into a litigation process that will bankrupt your little startup before it even gets off the ground. You are absolutely welcome to terminate the agreement," I said softly, delivering the verbal equivalent of a paper cut. "However, I highly recommend you review the penalty clauses before you make that emotional decision. As per our signed agreement, the initial 50% deposit remains entirely non-refundable. Furthermore, your critical live evaluation with the Hearthline Board of Directors is exactly 12 days away. If I disconnect from your servers today, your warehouse floors will revert to total systemic failure within 48 hours. You will lose the Hearthline contract, and subsequently, your entire banking refinance package will completely collapse." The silence on the other end of the line was absolute and profoundly satisfying. For the very first time in his lucrative, sheltered career, Nolan Pierce was securely locked inside a cage constructed entirely out of his own arrogant signature. "I will see your engineering team on the morning check-in call," I stated, and I ended the connection without waiting for his response. The irony of the situation was exquisite. Carrington was forcibly paying my exorbitant daily rate, and I was using that very same capital to quietly build the exact weapon that was making their rivals stronger. 2 days later, the industry news officially broke. Blue Veil Distribution had successfully made the final shortlist for the massive Gulf Harvest cooperative contract, heavily bolstered by the flawless transition architecture my firm had designed for them. Carrington, drowning in their own internal failures and bleeding cash, did not even make it past the preliminary review stage. My quiet, strategic defiance began to act like a powerful magnet. The shift leader who had texted me in the middle of the night officially resigned from Carrington. He was followed less than a week later by one of the sharpest senior project managers from the Hearthline War Room. They both walked away from stable corporate benefits and established hierarchies to join Simmons' cutover group. They did not jump ship for an immediate pay raise. They came over because they were deeply exhausted by the toxic culture of covering up executive incompetence. They wanted to work for a leader who actually understood the microscopic details of the supply chain, someone who built structural solutions instead of actively hunting for scapegoats. In the span of just a few short weeks, what had started as a desperate, defensive maneuver on a scratched rental house dining table had rapidly evolved. Simmons' cutover group was no longer just a legal shield to process consulting fees. We were a highly specialized, razor-sharp boutique firm, exclusively dedicated to rescuing the massive warehouse transition projects that bloated, arrogant logistics corporations inevitably butchered. Our operation was lean, completely remote, and ruthlessly efficient. But the most profound shift during this period of rapid expansion did not happen on a balance sheet or during a tense video conference. It happened late one evening in our living room. I was sitting on the fabric sofa with my laptop resting on my knees, trying to format a digital presentation deck for a prospective new client. I was an operational architect, not a graphic designer, and the slides looked rigid, gray, and painfully boring. Tessa walked into the room to get a glass of water. My 16-year-old daughter had been a quiet, resentful ghost since the day we packed up her debate trophies in Missouri. She usually avoided making eye contact, choosing to retreat to her room the second she finished her dinner. But tonight, she paused behind the sofa, her dark eyes tracking the clumsy blocks of text on my glowing screen. "That looks terrible," she said quietly. I froze, my fingers hovering slightly over the keyboard. It was the first time she had initiated an unprompted conversation with me in nearly 2 months. "I know," I admitted, keeping my voice gentle, terrified of spooking her back into her defensive shell. "I am trying to map out our primary service packages, but formatting is not exactly my strongest skill." Tessa set her water glass down on the side table. She walked slowly around the sofa and sat down next to me, leaving a few inches of space between us. She stared at the screen for a long moment, her brow furrowed in deep concentration. "You are using a default presentation template from 5 years ago," Tessa pointed out, a distinct hint of her old, sharp debate team confidence bleeding back into her voice. "The text alignment is completely off, and your color palette is incredibly depressing. It looks like a file put together by a sweaty technical engineer, not someone who is preparing to win big." I swallowed the sudden, thick lump forming in my throat. "Do you think you could fix it?" Tessa looked at me. Really looked at me. The hard, impenetrable wall she had built around herself seemed to waver, just for a fraction of a second. She reached out and gently pulled the laptop off my knees and onto her own lap. "Your core messaging is way too passive," she muttered, already opening a new design application and rapidly clicking through sleek layout options. "You need to highlight the risk mitigation factors on the very first slide. If you are going to charge these massive corporations a premium fee, you need to look expensive, Mom." I sat back against the cushions and silently watched my daughter work. Her fingers flew across the trackpad, her posture naturally straightening as she fell into the familiar, comforting rhythm of analyzing information and structuring a winning, persuasive argument. For the past 8 weeks, I had been completely consumed by the sheer, grinding mechanics of financial survival and corporate vengeance. I had focused all my waking energy on forcing Carrington to pay for what they broke. But watching Tessa expertly redesign my company profile, seeing the vital spark of engagement finally return to her eyes, I realized the absolute truth. Bringing a massive influx of capital into the house was a basic necessity, but it was not the real victory. The real victory was sitting right next to me. I was not just pulling money back into our lives. I was painstakingly pulling back the profound respect and belief of my own daughter. And as Tessa hit the save button on a sleek, beautifully aggressive title slide, I knew without a shadow of a doubt that no corporate executive on earth was ever going to take that away from me again. The technical sprint culminated on a late Sunday night. We ran the preliminary trial cutover for the Hearthline Markets integration at exactly 2 o'clock in the morning, taking advantage of the lowest volume window on the warehouse floor. I sat perfectly still in my home office, my eyes scanning the dual monitors as the live inventory data bypassed their failing legacy software and routed directly through the new automated logic I had painstakingly restructured. For 4 agonizing hours, nobody breathed. Then, the confirmation signals began rolling in across the dashboard. The routing errors dropped to 0. The outbound trucks departed the loading bays completely full, precisely on schedule. We had successfully pulled their most valuable client back from the absolute edge of the cliff. The corporate reaction to this massive operational victory was incredibly swift, but it did not come in the form of gratitude. It came in the form of a highly calculated containment strategy. Less than 48 hours after the successful trial run, I received a direct, private email from Evelyn Cross. She was a senior partner on the Carrington Freight Logic Board of Directors, a woman whose name I had only previously seen on highly classified financial disclosure forms. She did not want to schedule a virtual meeting. She flew down to Florida and invited me to a private, late-morning brunch at an exclusive, heavily guarded country club located right on the edge of the bay. Evelyn was a masterclass in corporate elegance. She wore a tailored suit, ordered her sparkling water with a polite smile, and waited until the waiter had entirely cleared our pristine white plates before she slid a thick cream-colored envelope across the mahogany table. "You have done a genuinely remarkable job, Amelia," Evelyn said, her voice smooth and perfectly modulated. "The board is incredibly impressed with the sheer velocity of your intervention. You saved the Hearthline account from immediate collapse." I did not touch the envelope. I simply maintained eye contact, waiting for the hidden blade to slide out from beneath the velvet compliment. Carrington operates at its best when all of its critical assets are safely under one roof, Evelyn continued, folding her hands neatly on the table. "We want to formally acquire Simmons Cutover Group. The term sheet inside that envelope outlines a very aggressive cash purchase. We are offering you a multi-year executive contract, a highly elevated senior vice president title, and a signing bonus that reflects our deep appreciation for your recent heroics." She paused, offering a warm, practiced smile that did not quite reach her cold eyes. "It is a highly generous package. Amelia, we want to bring you back inside the family and close the past in a civilized manner." I looked down at the expensive envelope, instantly dissecting the true anatomy of her proposal. The sheer brilliance of the trap was almost admirable. If I accepted the millions of dollars to sell my firm, I would instantly become a Carrington employee again. My independent company would be legally dissolved, absorbed entirely into their corporate structure, and with that absorption would come an impenetrable, ironclad non-disclosure agreement and a ruthless non-compete clause. They were not offering to buy my technical expertise. They were desperately trying to purchase my silence. They knew exactly what I had uncovered regarding their fraudulent financial ledgers, and they wanted to lock me securely inside a golden cage where they could legally control every single piece of data I possessed. "I appreciate the board taking the time to draft this," I replied calmly, deliberately leaving the envelope sitting on the table. "I will need to review the terms carefully before making any structural decisions regarding my firm." Evelyn's smile tightened by a fraction of a millimeter. She recognized the polite deflection, but the rules of high-level corporate warfare demanded that we maintain the civilized illusion. The contrast to Carrington's veiled hostility arrived the very next afternoon. Dana Kell from Blue Veil Distribution called my cell phone. She did not offer to buy me out. Instead, she offered Simmons Cutover Group a highly lucrative, multi-year strategic partnership to act as their primary technical vanguard for all future mixed facility integrations. Blue Veil wanted to secure my brain, but they actively wanted me to remain an entirely independent contractor. They respected my autonomy because they understood that a sovereign, motivated partner was vastly more valuable than a heavily monitored, captive employee. It was the ultimate validation. It proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that I had viable, highly profitable options that absolutely did not require me to bend my knee to the people who had tried to ruin me. The final, most pathetic attempt at containment occurred 3 days later. Nolan Pierce sent me a brief, informal text message, asking if I would be willing to meet him for a quick cup of coffee to talk personally. We met at a crowded, noisy coffee shop in the downtown business district. Nolan looked entirely different from the arrogant executive who had tried to intimidate me over the phone weeks earlier. He looked haggard, his skin gray and his posture slumped. He ordered a black coffee, sat across from me at a small corner table, and spent the first 10 minutes engaging in useless, awkward small talk about the brutal Florida humidity. I did not offer him any conversational life rafts. I sat quietly, sipping my tea, letting the heavy, uncomfortable silence force him into a corner. "I wanted to apologize, Amelia," Nolan finally said, his voice dropping low so the neighboring tables could not hear him, "for how the relocation was handled. The entire transition was an absolute mess, and I know your family took the brunt of it. The relocation was handled exactly as you instructed the Human Resources Department to handle it." "Nolan," I stated, my tone devoid of any emotion. He winced slightly, nervously running a hand through his thinning hair. "You have to understand the immense pressure we were under. The banking syndicate was completely threatening to pull our entire refinancing package. They demanded immediate, aggressive cuts to our operating budget right before the end of the fiscal quarter. If we did not show a massive reduction in executive overhead, the entire loan was going to fail." I watched him carefully. I did not pull out my phone to record the conversation. I did not make any sudden movements or aggressive accusations. My mind locked onto every word, every timeline, and every name he offered up in his desperate attempt to clear his own conscience. "Gavin Reese knew about the mandatory hiring freeze a full week before I sold my house in Missouri," I said softly, laying a single piece of bait on the table. Nolan sighed, looking down at his coffee cup, completely oblivious to the legal trap he was stepping into. "We all knew. The executive committee approved the freeze 30 days prior. But Hearthline Markets was panicking about the technical leadership on the new project. We desperately needed your resume on the active roster to pacify their board of directors and secure their final signature on the contract extension. I authorized Gavin to push your paperwork through, knowing full well we would have to cut your role the moment you arrived." He looked up at me, his expression twisting into a sickening mask of misplaced corporate camaraderie. "It was a purely mathematical decision. Amelia, it was never personal. Honestly, looking at your background, I knew you were incredibly resilient. I thought someone like you would eventually be fine." The air in my lungs turned instantly to ice. The sheer, unadulterated sociopathy of that single sentence echoed in my ears. He had willingly destroyed my husband's career, uprooted my children, and pushed my family toward the absolute edge of financial ruin. All because he casually assumed I possessed the requisite grit to survive the trauma he was actively inflicting upon me. He had used my strength as the ultimate justification for his own profound cowardice. I did not throw my hot tea in his face. I did not raise my voice or deliver a dramatic monologue about vengeance. The most dangerous people in any room are the ones who do not need to shout. "Thank you for clarifying the timeline, Nolan," I said, my voice as smooth and placid as a mirror. "It is always incredibly helpful to understand the strategic thinking behind executive decisions." I stood up, picked up my leather bag, and left him sitting alone at the small table. That evening, I drafted a highly formal, one-paragraph email to Evelyn Cross and the entire Carrington Board of Directors. I explicitly declined their generous acquisition offer. I informed them that Simmons Cutover Group would fiercely maintain its status as an independent entity and would continue to serve the broader logistics market on our own terms. I hit send and closed the laptop. They had tried to starve me, and I had survived. They had tried to intimidate me with legal threats, and I had outmaneuvered them. Finally, they had tried to buy my forgiveness, and I had flatly rejected their money. I realized in that quiet moment exactly why the Carrington executives were now deeply, fundamentally terrified of me. They possessed absolutely nothing that I wanted, which meant they had absolutely no way left to control what was coming next. I flew Rachel Baines down to Tampa on a humid Wednesday morning. Rachel was a highly aggressive, meticulously sharp employment attorney who built her entire career specializing in unwinding complex corporate fraud. She did not operate on emotion. She operated on absolute, undeniable leverage. Together with the senior regional manager from Phoenix and the logistics director from Pittsburgh, we quietly formed a completely unified, airtight legal front. We spent dozens of grueling hours on secure video conference calls, cross-referencing our termination dates, our relocation packages, and the identical, highly scripted language their human resources department had used to discard us. We possessed more than enough raw evidence to file a massive class action lawsuit right then and there, but I firmly instructed Rachel to hold the paperwork. Filing a standard lawsuit would merely trigger a slow, grinding war of attrition. Carrington Freight Logic had an army of expensive defense lawyers who would immediately force the case into private, sealed arbitration, dragging the legal process out for 3 to 5 years until we were all thoroughly bankrupted by the exorbitant legal fees. I did not want a quiet settlement negotiated behind closed doors. I needed maximum, undeniable public exposure. I was deliberately waiting for the exact moment their corporate armor was at its absolute thinnest, a moment where the truth would instantly fracture their foundation and send shockwaves through their clients, their board of directors, and their financial lenders all at once. That perfect vulnerability materialized with terrifying speed just days later. An internal compliance officer deep inside Hearthline Markets unexpectedly unearthed a buried email chain during a routine performance review. The digital thread clearly proved that Carrington's engineering leadership had been repeatedly warned about the fatal integration flaws between their new robotics and the legacy warehouse software several months before the project even launched. The emails proved that Carrington had actively chosen to bury the severe technical warnings just to secure the massive client contract. Furious and feeling completely deceived, Hearthline triggered an immediate, emergency operational audit. They demanded a comprehensive, mandatory review meeting scheduled for Friday morning. The stakes were suddenly raised to an apocalyptic level. It was no longer just a standard technical check-in. Hearthline officially invited their aggressive external legal counsel, the entire Carrington board of directors, and the lead representatives from the banking syndicate who were actively handling Carrington's impending, life-saving refinance package. Every single entity that held power over Nolan Pierce's survival was going to be sitting at the exact same mahogany table. I immediately called Dana Kell at Blue Veil Distribution. We quickly and quietly finalized our ultimate contingency protocol. If Carrington was officially stripped of the Phase 2 expansion contract during that Friday audit due to gross negligence, Blue Veil was completely prepped and fully capitalized to absorb the massive Hearthline account within 48 hours. Furthermore, my firm, Simmons Cutover Group, was formally locked in by contract to spearhead the entire technical handover. The pieces on the board were now perfectly aligned, forming an inescapable perimeter. Carrington's executive team must have sensed the tightening noose. Realizing that I was the primary technical witness expected to report at the Friday audit, on Thursday evening, less than 14 hours before the review, my inbox chimed with a high-priority alert. It was a final, desperate play from their general counsel. They sent over a highly confidential, expedited settlement agreement. I read through the digital document, my eyes tracking the numbers. The financial compensation figure was absolutely staggering. It was enough money to easily pay for Tessa's entire college tuition in cash, completely wipe out our remaining mortgage, and permanently secure our financial future for the next 2 decades. But the attached legal stipulations were draconian and deeply toxic. The contract required an immediate, lifetime non-disclosure agreement. More importantly, it contained a highly specific, ironclad clause legally barring me from providing any testimony, shared documentation, or strategic assistance to any other former employees regarding the relocation fraud. They were not offering restitution or taking accountability for their actions. They were offering a massive, calculated bribe to buy my complete silence and permanently isolate the other victims in Phoenix and Pittsburgh. I thought about the profound, suffocating terror I had felt sitting at my kitchen island 2 months ago, frantically counting the days until our bank account hit zero. I thought about my husband grading papers in a noisy study hall just to keep our health insurance active. I printed the settlement document, walked deliberately into the kitchen, and dropped the thick stack of paper directly into the trash can without a single second of hesitation. It was the ultimate validation. You cannot buy the silence of someone who no longer needs your money. I stood by the kitchen counter, taking a deep, grounding breath. I did not realize I was not alone until I heard a slight shift of weight on the hardwood floor behind me. Tessa was standing in the shadows of the hallway, holding a woven laundry basket. She had quietly listened to my entire heated phone call with Rachel Baines regarding the immediate rejection of the settlement money. I braced myself for the familiar, heavy wall of teenage resentment, fully expecting her to question why I was turning away millions of dollars. Instead, she set the basket down on the floor and walked right up to me. "You are not taking their money," she stated, her voice remarkably steady and completely devoid of judgment. "No," I replied softly, looking at my 16-year-old daughter. "I am not. Because taking that money means leaving the others trapped in the exact same nightmare we went through." Tessa looked at the trash can, then looked up directly into my eyes. The dark, impenetrable resentment that had clouded her expression for the past 3 months was completely gone. In its place was a fierce, piercing clarity that mirrored my own exact determination. "I need you to know something, Mom," she said, her tone carrying a profound maturity that caught me completely off guard. "I was incredibly angry when we first moved down here. I hated leaving my debate team, and I hated leaving my friends. But I never blamed you, not once. You did everything exactly right for our family. I blamed the people who lied to you. They are the ones who broke the rules and treated us like garbage." She stepped closer, her jaw set firmly. "Make them pay for it." I pulled my daughter into a tight, desperate embrace, resting my chin on top of her head. I closed my eyes as the very last remaining knot of suffocating, lingering guilt finally dissolved and vanished from my chest. I was no longer fighting with the heavy weight of regret anchoring me down. Daniel spent the rest of the tense evening expertly managing the household, creating a quiet, uninterrupted sanctuary for me to work. He took Owen to the local batting cages for 2 hours to ensure the house remained completely silent, and he periodically brought me fresh, steaming mugs of black coffee. He was the silent, unshakable anchor that allowed me to operate with absolute precision in the center of the storm. I retreated to my home office, locked the heavy wooden door, and spread the printed documents across the wide surface of my desk. The air in the room felt incredibly thin, actively vibrating with the highly compressed energy of a tightly coiled spring. I meticulously organized the timeline of destruction into distinct, undeniable categories. First, I placed the aggressive recruitment emails from Gavin Reese, their timestamps clearly proving he pushed me to sign the paperwork exactly 5 days after the internal executive hiring freeze was secretly mandated. Next, I lined up the signed, legally binding relocation contracts for myself, the Phoenix manager, and the Pittsburgh director, highlighting the identical language used to trap all 3 of us. Then, I neatly stacked the original technical warnings I had issued during my interview regarding the robotic integration flaws, proving Carrington had knowingly sold a defective architecture to their biggest client. Finally, I placed the lethal kill shot squarely in the center of the desk, the leaked internal financial ledger. It explicitly proved that my high executive salary was completely retained in their operating budget long after they had terminated me under the false guise of severe financial restructuring. I sat down in my leather office chair and slowly opened the lid of my laptop. The screen flared to life, casting a pale, cool light across the dark room. It was the exact same piece of hardware that had sat on a scratched dining table months ago. It was the exact same screen that had displayed Marla Kent's sterile, robotic face when she casually erased my family's entire trajectory in a 30-second video call. Back then, it had felt like a terrifying window into my own unraveling, a screen that delivered nothing but helplessness and ruin. But tonight, the dynamic was entirely different. As the glowing cursor blinked steadily over the neatly organized digital folders containing every single piece of undeniable, verified evidence, I felt a deep, profound sense of absolute control. I was no longer the victim of a corporate restructuring plan. Tomorrow morning, I was going to walk into a glass boardroom filled with incredibly powerful people, and the simple documents currently sitting right on my desktop were going to completely demolish a chief executive officer. The emergency review convened at exactly 9 o'clock on Friday morning inside the sprawling glass boardroom of the downtown Marriott. It felt less like a standard operational audit and more like a high-stakes corporate tribunal. The massive mahogany table was entirely surrounded by the heaviest hitters in the industry. The Hearthline Markets executive team sat on the left, flanked by their aggressive external legal counsel. On the right sat the Carrington Board of Directors, including Evelyn Cross, alongside the deeply nervous representatives from the Tier 1 banking syndicate. Nolan Pierce sat at the very head of the table, desperately trying to project an aura of calm, executive control. He genuinely believed I was just there to deliver a sanitized technical progress report and confirm that the distribution hubs were safely back online. Nolan cleared his throat and officially opened the meeting. He spent the first 10 minutes weaving a masterful, highly polished narrative about Carrington's swift, decisive action in resolving a minor software communication glitch. He then turned his focus to me, smiling a tight, artificial smile, and invited me to present the technical validation. I stood up smoothly, connected my laptop to the main projector, and picked up the laser pointer. But I did not pull up the current system metrics. The lead operations director for Hearthline leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. Before we review the current patch, Amelia, we need a definitive answer. Why did our entire supply chain nearly collapse last week? How did Carrington completely miss this integration bottleneck? I looked directly at Nolan, then turned my gaze back to the Hearthline executives. They did not miss it, I stated, my voice echoing clearly in the dead, silent room. I clicked the presentation remote. The massive screen behind me illuminated, displaying a high-resolution scan of an email thread dated 4 months prior. During my final executive interview, I explicitly warned Carrington's lead engineering team about this exact foundational flaw. I informed them that the new robotics could not communicate cleanly with your legacy mixed facility software. I told them the system would bottleneck and fail. They completely ignored the warning to secure your contract signature. A collective, sharp intake of breath swept through the Hearthline side of the table. Nolan turned absolutely chalk white, stammering an incoherent objection. But before his general counsel could even open his mouth to intervene, the heavy oak doors at the back of the room swung open. Rachel Baines walked in, carrying a thick leather briefcase. I formally introduced her to the room as my retained legal counsel. Rachel did not waste a single second. She systematically distributed thick, bound dossiers to the Hearthline executives, the board members, and the banking syndicate representatives. What you are looking at is not just a technical oversight, Rachel announced, her voice sharp and commanding. It is a documented pattern of gross corporate fraud. She walked the room through the sworn affidavits from the victims in Phoenix and Pittsburgh. She displayed the identical relocation contracts. She laid bare the exact timeline, proving Carrington knowingly used high-level executive recruitment as a fraudulent coat of paint to pacify nervous clients like Hearthline. Then, she delivered the final, fatal blow. She projected the leaked internal budget ledger onto the massive screen, clearly showing my high executive salary still actively sitting on the third quarter books, weeks after I had been unceremoniously terminated for a fabricated lack of funding. The Hearthline executives stared at the screen, absolute fury radiating from their faces. They realized in real time that Carrington had intentionally hidden severe leadership instability and massive operational risks throughout the entire deployment of their most vital contract. The Hearthline lead counsel did not wait for a private deliberation. Right there at the mahogany table, he formally declared Carrington in severe breach of contract. He officially terminated their Phase 2 expansion rights and aggressively activated the multi-million-dollar penalty clauses. Furthermore, he announced that the emergency transition contract was being immediately shifted to a joint venture led by Blue Veil Distribution and Simmons Cutover Group. The devastation was instantaneous. The lead representative from the banking syndicate stood up, aggressively buttoned his suit jacket, and announced that the entire refinancing package was officially frozen pending a formal governance review. Nolan Pierce just sat there, completely paralyzed, physically shrinking in his expensive leather chair as the walls of his empire violently collapsed inward. Within exactly 3 days, the Carrington Board of Directors forced Nolan to immediately resign in absolute disgrace. Gavin Reese, The slick recruiter who had lied to my face for months was subsequently dragged into a grueling series of private legal depositions. Stripped of their most lucrative client and bleeding cash, Carrington's legal department completely surrendered. They were forced to settle with all of the relocation victims. We secured a massive financial payout, full coverage of our exorbitant legal fees, and binding documents completely clearing our professional records. They did not settle out of a sudden sense of moral obligation. They paid us because the sheer cost of continuing their lie had finally eclipsed the brutal cost of the truth. The dust eventually settled, leaving a completely transformed landscape behind. I took a significant portion of my settlement money and my consulting profits and purchased a beautiful, sprawling new house in a highly sought-after Tampa neighborhood. We did not rent. We owned every single brick of it, entirely funded by my own autonomy and hard work. Daniel secured a fantastic position as the lead principal at a top-tier private academy just a few miles down the road. Tessa threw herself back into the competitive debate circuit, quickly lining up a flawless array of out-of-state college scholarships. Owen found his stride pitching for an elite travel baseball team, his room proudly decorated with fresh trophies. I sat on our new back patio one warm Friday evening, holding a glass of wine and listening to the happy sounds of my family echoing from the kitchen. I thought about Marla Kent looking through a webcam and casually erasing my entire life. She had coldly stated that my role no longer existed because plans had changed. I took a slow, deeply satisfying sip of my wine, a genuine smile spreading across my face in the quiet evening air. Yes, the plans had definitely changed, but this time, I was the one writing them. Thank you so much for listening to my story today. I would absolutely love to know where you are tuning in from. So please leave a comment down below with your city or country, so we can connect and share our thoughts on navigating these crazy corporate battles. If you enjoyed this journey of taking back control, please make sure to subscribe to the Boss Revenge Stories channel. Hit that like button, and support the channel even more by clicking the hype button so this video can reach and empower even more people out there.